There is a date carved into the official story of America's most famous wilderness that almost nobody questions. The 1st of March, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed a bill, and suddenly 2.2 million acres of land in the Wyoming Territory became protected federal property. The first national park in the world, they say. A gift to the American people. A shining moment of environmental foresight. And if you've ever visited Yellowstone, you've probably stood at the edge of Old Faithful and thought, yeah, this makes sense. Of course someone wanted to protect this. Of course this belongs to everyone. But here's the thing, nobody in that visitor center is going to tell you. The land wasn't empty when the government decided to protect it. The infrastructure wasn't primitive. The roads, the bridges, the bathhouses, the hotels that appeared almost immediately after 1872, they didn't come from nothing. And the economic machinery that took over the moment the park was declared. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It was too fast, too organized, and too profitable to be the work of a government that had just discovered a wilderness. The question isn't whether Yellowstone is beautiful. It is. The question is who controlled it before 1872, who lost it when the park was created, and why the official story requires you to believe that nothing of significance existed there until the federal government arrived. To answer that, you have to look at what was actually happening in the American West in the decades before the park was declared. And when you do, the story starts to fall apart in ways that should make you deeply uncomfortable. Let's go back further than 1872. Let's go back to the maps. In the early 1800s, European cartographers were producing increasingly detailed maps of the North American continent. Some of these maps, now archived in libraries and universities across the world, show infrastructure in areas that American history insists were unexplored wilderness at the time: roads, settled zones, networks of trails that look less like indigenous footpaths and more like planned transit corridors. When you overlay some of these older maps against the official settlement timelines, the discrepancies are difficult to explain away as cartographic error, because the same anomalous features appear on maps produced independently by different nations and different mapmakers. The Yellowstone Plateau sits at an elevation of roughly 7,700 feet. The winters are brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping far below zero and snow accumulations that can isolate the region for months at a time. The terrain is volcanic, unstable, and genuinely dangerous. For modern historians, this geography is used to explain why it took so long for European settlers to find the place. The argument is that the difficulty of access kept it isolated and untouched until the survey expeditions of the late 1860s and early 1870s. But that explanation doesn't hold up when you look at what happened immediately after 1872. Within just a few years of the park's creation, the Northern Pacific Railroad had established a major route to Yellowstone's northern entrance. Hotels were being built, stagecoach companies were running organized tours, supply depots were established. By the 1880s, Yellowstone was receiving tens of thousands of visitors per year. The infrastructure appeared so quickly that historians typically credit it to the railroad boom and Gilded Age entrepreneurialism, as if a remote volcanic plateau could be transformed into a functioning tourist economy in less than a decade through sheer ambition. What they don't ask is this: how do you build that kind of tourist infrastructure in a remote volcanic plateau at 7,700 feet elevation this fast, without pre-existing roads, without established supply chains, without a prior working knowledge of the terrain, without years of trial and error figuring out which routes are passable in which seasons? The answer, if you've been paying attention to alternative researchers working in what's broadly called the Tartaria framework, is that you don't build it from scratch, you inherit it. The Tartaria hypothesis, for those unfamiliar, proposes that prior to the mid-1800s, there existed on the North American continent a sophisticated civilization, or network of civilizations, that has been systematically erased from official history. The evidence cited by researchers in this space includes the so-called mud flood phenomenon, the anomalous architecture of many 19th century buildings, the suspicious World's Fair constructions that appeared and then vanished, and the discrepancies in population records, land surveys, and city founding dates throughout the American frontier. Yellowstone fits into this framework in a specific and particularly compelling way, because Yellowstone is not just a beautiful landscape. It sits on one of the most geologically active and economically significant zones on the North American continent. The geothermal features alone represent an energy resource of extraordinary value. The mineral deposits in and around the park are substantial. The timber was, before federal protection, some of the most commercially desirable old-growth forest in the American West. When you look at Yellowstone through an economic lens, rather than a romantic wilderness lens, the question becomes different. The question becomes, who had access to these resources before 1872, and what happened to them when the federal government declared eminent domain over 2.2 million acres? Let's look at the Hayden Survey, because it's the official justification for the park's creation, and it contains anomalies that deserve more attention. Ferdinand Hayden led the 1,871 geological survey of the Yellowstone region. His report to Congress was instrumental in convincing legislators to create the park. Illustrated by Thomas Moran's paintings and William Henry Jackson's photographs, it presented Yellowstone as pristine, untouched wilderness. But Hayden wasn't the first American to visit Yellowstone. John Coulter reportedly passed through around 1,807. Multiple expeditions went in 1869 and 1870. Hayden himself had been in the area years before his 1871 survey. Here's the problem. These discovery expeditions keep encountering things that suggest prior human presence. They find old campsites that don't match known indigenous patterns. They find clearings that seem too regular to be natural. They find, in some accounts, evidence of old structures, stone foundations, and remnants of what looks like organized habitation rather than seasonal camping. The official history categorizes these as indigenous settlements. And those tribes absolutely did use the land. Their presence is documented and real. But the anomalies early explorers noted don't always match the material culture of those groups, and historians have been content not to ask too many questions about the discrepancies. When a finding doesn't fit the accepted framework, the path of least resistance is to file it under the nearest acceptable category and move on. Now let's talk about the railroad, because this is where the economic history becomes impossible to ignore. J. Cook and Company, the banking firm that financed the Northern Pacific Railroad, was one of the primary lobbying forces behind the creation of Yellowstone National Park. This is documented history, not conspiracy theory. J. Cook saw the railroad connection to Yellowstone as enormously profitable, and he lobbied hard for the park's creation because a federally protected wilderness destination would drive passenger traffic on his line. The mudflood researchers have documented extensively what they call reset events in American cities, where ground floors of 19th century buildings appear to have been buried, where city layouts on older maps don't match what was built after the Civil War, where an entire layer of prior civilization seems to have been paved over. The railroad routes of the American West fit this pattern in interesting ways. Many new railroad lines of the post-Civil War era followed paths that, on pre-war maps, appear to trace existing corridors. The railroads weren't always cutting through virgin wilderness. In many cases, they were following roads that were already there. If that's true of the Northern Pacific's approach to Yellowstone, it reframes the entire story. The railroad didn't open up an isolated wilderness for the first time. It integrated an already accessed zone into a new commercial network, one designed to route the profits of that access toward a new class of financial interests. The track wasn't a discovery. It was an acquisition, a way of claiming and monetizing infrastructure that already existed by overlaying it with something new and calling the whole thing progress. The hotel history of Yellowstone is one of the most revealing threads in this entire story. The National Hotel at Mammoth Hot Springs opened in 1883. The Fountain Hotel near the Lower Geyser Basin opened in 1891. The Old Faithful Inn, one of the most famous wooden structures in the United States, opened in 1904. These are described as being built from scratch, constructed with materials hauled in from enormous distances over difficult terrain by crews working in conditions that would challenge modern construction equipment. The Old Faithful Inn, in particular, is a fascinating case. It's a massive log structure, 700 feet long at its base, rising 7 stories in its central section. It was built in a single winter between 1903 and 1904 by a construction crew working at altitude in brutal cold with materials supposedly sourced from within the park. The architect was Robert Reamer, who was 29 years old at the time and had, by most accounts, no prior experience with a project remotely approaching this scale or complexity. Think about what that actually requires. You need to fell, transport, and shape thousands of logs. You need to engineer a 7-story structure that can withstand the snow loads of a Yellowstone winter. You need to coordinate a large labor force in a location with no nearby town, no established infrastructure, and a building season measured in months. And you need to do all of it in a single winter, finishing in time for the next tourist season. The official story attributes the speed and success of the construction to Reamer's genius, the railroad's supply capacity, and the determination of the Yellowstone Park Association. And perhaps that's all it was. But in the context of revisionist architectural history, a massive, expertly constructed wooden building, completed in a single winter at 7,700 feet elevation by a young architect's first major commission, raises questions that the standard account never quite answers. When you look at the building itself, it doesn't look like something designed and built for the first time. It looks like something built by people who already knew how to do it. The scale, the integration of the natural features, the sophistication of the interior spaces, these characteristics are more consistent with a building tradition that already existed than with a single, inspired act of pioneer architecture. Let's talk about the geothermal features, because this is where the Tartaria hypothesis intersects with something economically significant. The hot springs at Mammoth Hot Springs were used for bathing almost immediately after the park's creation. Bathhouses were constructed. The mineral-rich waters were promoted for their health benefits. By the late 1800s, Mammoth Hot Springs had become a resort destination. The exploitation of thermal springs for medicinal and recreational bathing is an extremely ancient practice. Roman baths, European spa towns, Japanese and Icelandic hot spring resorts. The existence of human settlements around thermal features is one of the most consistent patterns in the archaeological record, going back thousands of years. When the Hayden expedition and subsequent visitors arrived at Mammoth Hot Springs, the official narrative is that they were encountering these features for essentially the first time in the context of Western civilization. But there are accounts from early park visitors describing stonework around some of the hot spring features that appeared older than the park itself. There are references in early park reports to structures that required clearing or modification rather than construction from scratch. These accounts are scattered and often ambiguous, and individually none of them proves anything. But taken together, they suggest that the landscape the early park administration inherited was not the pure wilderness the official founding narrative requires it to be. The economic suppression argument is this. In the decades before 1872, the Yellowstone Plateau was being accessed and used by parties whose interests don't fit neatly into the official history of the American frontier. When the federal government declared it a national park, it didn't just protect the landscape, it nationalized access to those resources. It rooted the economic benefits of geothermal access, timber, minerals, and eventually tourism through a specific set of approved channels. The parties who had previously been accessing those resources were displaced, their presence erased from the record, their infrastructure absorbed or destroyed. What makes Yellowstone interesting is that the prior claim may have been more complex than simple indigenous land rights, a set of commercial or civilizational interests that the official founding mythology of the national park system was designed to obscure. This is the part the standard history simply cannot accommodate, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the wilderness was never empty, that someone was there first, and that the act of protection, was also an act of dispossession. The Yellowstone Hotel Company, which eventually became the contemporary park concession system, has been operated by a succession of corporate entities throughout the park's history. The profits from visitor services within the park have always flowed to private interests operating under federal concession agreements. The public pays to enter the park. The public owns the land in a nominal sense. But the economic activity within the park has always been privately captured. That is not a bug in the national park system. It is a feature. It is how the system was designed from the beginning, when Jay Cooke and the Northern Pacific Railroad were lobbying Congress to create the first national park. The genius of the arrangement is that it presents private capture as public ownership, so the people funding the system believe they are its beneficiaries. In the 1800s, geothermal heat was primarily valuable for its surface expressions, the hot springs, the geysers, the mud pots. These were used for bathing, mineral extraction, and increasingly for tourism. The hotel and railroad interests that coalesced around Yellowstone in the 1870s and 1880s were essentially monetizing the surface geothermal features, turning natural wonders into ticketed attractions and the foundation of a tourism economy. But the deeper resource, the actual heat of the volcanic system beneath the park, was not economically accessible in the 19th century. It still isn't fully accessible today. Yellowstone sits on one of the largest active volcanic systems in North America, and the geothermal potential of that system is, by some estimates, sufficient to power a significant portion of the American energy grid. The heat beneath that landscape represents one of the largest untapped energy reserves on the continent. The national park designation effectively placed that resource in federal hands permanently. It cannot be drilled. It cannot be commercially developed. No private company can build a geothermal plant in Yellowstone. The energy potential of the Yellowstone supervolcano sits, by law, locked away from private development, and any attempt to access it is treated not as innovation, but as desecration of a protected national treasure. In the framework of revisionist economic history, this is not an accident. The national park system, which Yellowstone inaugurated, has been used throughout its history to place resource-rich land under federal control in ways that simultaneously serve the narrative of public benefit, while ensuring that the deepest and most valuable resources are controlled rather than freely accessed. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. The protection narrative and the resource control function are not in tension. They work together. The people who benefit from that arrangement are not the general public visiting Old Faithful. They are the financial and political structures that control federal land management and the energy sector. And the people who lost out when Yellowstone was declared a national park were whoever had been accessing that landscape before 1872 and whatever interests they represented. Here is something that mainstream environmental history of Yellowstone consistently underemphasizes. The indigenous peoples who lived in and around the Yellowstone Plateau were actively removed from the park after 1872. The Shoshone, the Bannock, the Crow, the Blackfeet, all had relationships with the Yellowstone landscape. After the park was created, the federal government progressively restricted and then eliminated indigenous presence within park boundaries. By the early 20th century, indigenous peoples had been effectively excluded from the park entirely. This is now acknowledged in official Yellowstone history, usually in the form of a brief acknowledgement followed by discussion of recent reconciliation efforts. What gets less attention is the specificity of what was lost. The Shoshone in particular had knowledge of the Yellowstone geothermal system that was extraordinarily detailed. They knew which springs were drinkable and which were toxic. They knew the seasonal patterns of geyser activity. They knew the medicinal properties of specific mineral waters. They had developed, over generations, a practical working knowledge of one of the most complex geological environments on the continent. When they were removed from the park, that knowledge was removed with them. What remained was the landscape itself, now owned by the federal government and managed for the benefit of railroad companies and hotel operators who had no generational relationship with it and no interest in its deeper patterns. The men who ran the concessions saw geysers as attractions. The people who had lived there saw a system they understood intimately. The Tartaria framework suggests the indigenous relationship with this landscape may have been more sophisticated than the hunter-gatherer model official history assigns to it. If prior civilizational structures existed in the Yellowstone region, the indigenous peoples living there afterward would have been inheritors of a landscape already bearing marks of organized human activity. Their knowledge of the land may have included knowledge of those prior structures and uses, passed down through oral tradition across generations. Removing them from the land removed that knowledge from circulation, and with it, any living memory of what the landscape had been before. Let's bring this forward to the 20th century, because the economic story of Yellowstone doesn't end in the 1870s. In 1988, the Yellowstone fires burned approximately 1.2 million acres, roughly 36% of the park. The fires were controversial. The park's let it burn management policy came under intense criticism. After the fires, the park recovered, and the recovery was used as a case study in natural fire ecology. What received less attention was the economic dimension. The fires created political cover for discussions about resource extraction that would have been more difficult to advance without a crisis. They generated significant federal expenditure that flowed through specific contractors and agencies. Each major Yellowstone event, the 1,988 fires, the 2009 earthquake swarm, the 2022 floods, produces a cycle of crisis, federal response, and economic restructuring. The park's status as federal land means every crisis is managed through federal channels, every rebuilding effort contracted through federal procurement, every policy revision determined through federal processes. The public has essentially no say in any of this, despite the romantic narrative that the park belongs to the American people. There are researchers who have spent years documenting what they call the infrastructure inheritance pattern in early American national parks. Working primarily outside mainstream academic channels, they identify a consistent anomaly. The speed with which permanent infrastructure appeared after federal designation consistently exceeds what should be possible given documented construction timelines and the known technological capacities of the period. In Yellowstone specifically, these researchers have documented discrepancies in construction records for several early park buildings, including inconsistencies in material sourcing, discrepancies in labor records, and architectural features that appear in multiple park structures simultaneously in ways suggesting a common design tradition rather than independent construction projects. Their conclusion, acknowledged as speculative but argued to be better supported by the physical evidence than the official account, is that the early park infrastructure was not built from scratch. It was modified from prior structures, some of which dated from before the park's creation. The official construction records documented the modification and expansion of existing features as if they were original construction. If that's right, the untouched wilderness narrative of Yellowstone's founding was not just romantic mythology. It was active historical suppression. Someone knew that prior infrastructure existed, and the official record was written to exclude that knowledge. The question of who benefits from this suppression is where the revisionist economic history framework becomes most important. The national park system has always served multiple interests simultaneously. It serves genuine conservation goals, it serves tourism and recreational interests. It serves the federal government's interest in controlling large areas of strategically important land, and it serves the interest of financial structures that profit from the management of public lands, the contractors, the concessionaires, the energy companies that operate at park borders, the investors who benefit from keeping certain resources off the commercial market. The Yellowstone Hotel Company, which became the Yellowstone Park Association, which eventually became the contemporary park concession system, has been operated by a succession of corporate entities throughout the park's history. The profits from visitor services within the park, the hotels, the restaurants, the gift shops, the guided tours, have always flowed to private interests operating under federal concession agreements. The public pays to enter the park. The public owns the land in a nominal sense, but the economic activity within the park has always been privately captured. That is not a bug in the national park system. It is a feature. It is how the system was designed from the beginning, when Jay Cooke and the Northern Pacific Railroad were lobbying Congress to create the first national park. Understanding that origin helps explain why the foundational mythology of Yellowstone, the untouched wilderness, the visionary conservation, the gift to the American people, has been so carefully maintained. The mythology justifies the arrangement. It makes the public feel like beneficiaries rather than what they actually are, which is the funding source for a system that primarily benefits those who control the concessions and the adjacent commercial infrastructure. Now, let's address the Tartaria connection directly. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its most rigorous form, proposes that a global civilization, or network of related civilizations, existed prior to the mid-19th century and was either destroyed or deliberately suppressed following some kind of catastrophic or political reset event. The material evidence cited includes the anomalous architecture of 19th century buildings across North America and Europe, the global distribution of star forts, the mud flood evidence of buried building foundations, and the inconsistencies in official historical timelines. Yellowstone fits into this framework not as a center of Tartarian civilization, because the geothermal instability of the region makes permanent settlement difficult, but as a node, a resource site, a place that a prior civilization would have known about, used, and potentially maintained infrastructure around, in the same way Roman civilizations built bath complexes around thermal springs across their empire. The reset the Tartaria hypothesis identifies would have cleared or buried surface evidence of prior use in many locations. The federal government's subsequent designation of Yellowstone as protected federal land would have provided a perfect institutional mechanism for preventing systematic archaeological investigation of what might remain beneath the surface. Think about that. Yellowstone National Park is one of the least archaeologically investigated major land areas in the United States. The official justification for limiting archaeological investigation within the park is conservation. But that justification also, conveniently, prevents the kind of systematic ground survey that might reveal evidence of prior habitation in forms that don't fit the official story. In 2002, researchers from the University of Montana conducted a limited archaeological survey near the Gardiner Basin on the park's northern boundary. They found evidence of human habitation going back approximately 11,000 years, consistent with accepted Paleo-Indian timelines. What got less coverage was their finding of what they described as organized lithic scatters, concentrations of worked stone suggesting more systematic land use than would be expected from purely nomadic populations. The report was published in a regional archaeological journal with a limited circulation. It generated no mainstream media coverage. It was not incorporated into the park's official interpretive materials. And follow-up investigation of the identified sites has not, as of available records, been conducted. This pattern repeats throughout the alternative research into Yellowstone and other national parks. Anomalous findings appear in limited circulation academic venues, generate no follow-up, and disappear into the archive. The official story remains unchanged. Here is the most important question, and the one the official history of Yellowstone is least equipped to answer. If Yellowstone was genuinely a pristine, uninhabited wilderness before 1872, why did it need to be protected? The conservation argument requires you to believe that the American government of 1872, which was simultaneously overseeing the violent displacement of indigenous peoples throughout the West, the environmental destruction of the Great Plains buffalo herds, and rampant industrial exploitation from Appalachia to California, suddenly experienced a moment of environmental enlightenment and decided to set aside 2.2 million acres for future generations. That's a remarkable thing to believe, especially when you look at who was in the room when the Yellowstone legislation was being drafted. The legislators, the lobbyists, the railroad men, the financial interests. These were not proto-environmentalists. They were the architects of the Gilded Age. The conservation argument serves as cover for something else. It serves as justification for federal control of a resource-rich zone whose prior arrangements needed to be cleared and whose future commercial access needed to be regulated through approved channels. The gift to the American people framing is brilliant, precisely because it's so emotionally satisfying. Who could be against protecting Old Faithful for future generations? The answer is whoever was already there. Whoever had been accessing and using the resources of that landscape, whoever's prior claim was being extinguished by the stroke of Grant's pen on the 1st of March 1872. We don't know, with certainty, who those people were. The official history has done a thorough job of ensuring that we don't know. The indigenous peoples who were there were documented and then removed. The fur trappers and mountain men who passed through left informal accounts that are hard to verify. The commercial interests that may have been operating in the region before federal designation left, if they left anything, records that are not in the public archive. But the absence of clear evidence is itself evidence of something. The systematic absence of a prior history for a landscape that humans have occupied for 11,000 years, that sits at the center of some of the most valuable geothermal resources in North America, that became commercially exploitable almost immediately after federal designation, is not the absence of history, it's the suppression of it. And the difference between those two things is everything, because one is a gap in the record and the other is a decision made by people with something to protect. The national park system is one of America's most beloved institutions, and that love is not undeserved. The landscapes it protects are genuinely extraordinary. The conservation achievements are real and significant, and millions of people have experienced something meaningful standing at the edge of these places. But love is not incompatible with scrutiny. The history of how these parks were created, who benefited from their creation, and what was erased in the process, is a history that deserves a great deal more scrutiny than it has ever received. Yellowstone was declared the first national park in the world. That's not just an environmental achievement. It's a claim, a legal claim on 2.2 million acres of land and everything above and below its surface. A claim that required the erasure of whoever and whatever came before. The story they need you to believe is that nothing came before. That before Grant signed that bill, it was just geysers and elk and pristine wilderness waiting to be discovered and protected. The story that the evidence suggests is more complicated, more contested, and more economically revealing than the official version has ever been willing to admit. And the fact that this question, the question of what was actually there before 1872, is still essentially unasked in mainstream historical discourse. That's not an oversight, that's policy. So why does this matter today? Because the pattern that Yellowstone established in 1872 is still running. Federal land designations, national monuments, protected wilderness areas, marine sanctuaries, these designations continue to happen. They continue to use the language of conservation and public benefit. They continue to clear prior claims and route resource access through approved federal channels. And they continue to be backed by the same coalition of interests, now updated: the energy sector, the financial sector, the federal bureaucracy, and the ideological infrastructure of mainstream environmentalism that provides the moral cover. Understanding Yellowstone as an economic story rather than a conservation story doesn't mean you have to want it destroyed. You can think Old Faithful is magnificent and still want to know who controlled the land before it became a national park. You can appreciate the preservation of the geothermal features and still ask why the archaeology of the pre-1872 landscape has been so systematically neglected. The wilderness narrative serves the people who benefit from the current arrangement. The historical narrative, the true one, with all its complications and erasures and prior claims, serves everyone else. One keeps you comfortable. The other makes you ask uncomfortable questions about who actually owns the things you were told belong to all of us, and why, and since exactly when. That gap in the record is not an accident of time or distance or poor bookkeeping by frontier clerks. It is the single most carefully maintained feature of the whole story, and it has held firm for well over 1 full century and still counting. Because the only way to understand what the national park system actually is, economically and politically, is to understand what it replaced. And what it replaced is the question they have spent 150 years making sure you never think to ask. Start asking it, and the whole story begins to look very different.